this serious buildup of an army, but then he comes in with an army of 100,000 soldiers. In a strange way, there was not first an air fight or something like that. He just went in and.
Listen, you're asking critical questions, and I'm sure we'll know the absolute facts. But let's back up and talk about what.
You understand?
Oh yes, yeah, I do now. I did not at the time.
Okay.
Neither did the Russians. Okay, and we have to understand this. When he first went in, I think he thought this was his opportunity to signal to us how serious he was, as though we were going to suddenly change our approach and take him seriously. He completely misjudged this.
Yeah.
Putin is someone that has always been of, major Russian figures, probably the single most Western-oriented or pro-Western leader of the bunch. Very much so.
Yeah, he lived in Germany for.
Yes, yeah, he did. You'd have to go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century to find Russian czars who had the kind of positive view of the West that he does, or did. And I think this was part of the problem. He assumed that we would react. Well, he didn't understand that our view of the Russians was completely skewed in favor of the Russians are weak, the Russians are corrupt, the Russians are stupid, the Russians are incapable. I mean, just go down the list. This is really what people in Washington thought. And I remember having conversations with some of them in these think tanks. And I tried to tell this one gentleman who's very prominent, you see him from time to time on YouTube and television. And I said, don't you understand? The Russian military is not the same as Western militaries. You may look at them and say, well, they don't seem to be quite as polished. They don't seem to be as well-equipped or well-fitted in their uniforms and so forth. Those things are superficial. The Russian army has always had this sort of loose-looking soldier. And it's always had large numbers of non-Russians with it. Units of Uzbeks and units of Chechens and others. This is not new.
Yeah, this is their history.
This is their history. I said, don't reach the wrong conclusions and don't assume that these people aren't going to fight for their country. Well, they're the ones who invaded. But from the standpoint of Putin, once he gets into Ukraine, what he thought was a problem is infinitely greater. Once they get into eastern Ukraine, not only do they find this monstrous Ukrainian army for which he was unprepared, he also finds the biolab.
But is the intelligence on both sides failing at the time?
Yeah, I think so. I think both sides misinterpreted and misread things. No question about it.
But how is that possible? Because there has always been a good relation between the Russian and the Ukrainians. He must have had spies or something like that.
There's two things going on here. Yes, the Ukrainians and the Russians have cooperated and gotten along from time to time. They also haven't. And as we built this army up, we began essentially stoking the fires of the Second World War. Remember, not an estimated 9 million Ukrainian lives, probably 2 more million Russians as well that never are mentioned, but 9 million Ukrainians were systematically murdered between 1929 and 1933. The man who did it was in the NKVD. His name was Yagoda, and he and his NKVD officers went in there after they'd emptied prisons inside Russia and brought convicts with them because the convicts could be relied upon to rape and murder and steal whatever they found, which is what they wanted to do. They were there to destroy what they said was the Ukrainian, what we would say is middle class, but in reality, these people took the opportunity to effectively destroy Ukraine.
Are you referring to the Holodomor?
Yes, yeah. And this also
the farmers.
But there's a cultural.
This is the wound in Ukraine.
Oh yeah, terrible, and this is one of the reasons why there were so many Ukrainians, and then later on many Russians as well, who went over to the Germans. This is something we don't talk about, but they began stoking these old fires, and there were always people in Western Ukraine who were enamored of National Socialism. And these symbols started showing up. And of course, this was done to aggravate the Russians on the one hand, but also to create the illusion that this was a new, superior army on the model of the German force.
You're referring to the Azov Regiment, for
example. Absolutely.
One of them.
And these things were funded by, at the time, Kolomoisky, who was Jewish. And remember, we had this man, Zalinski, who was Jewish, So you have the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, these symbols of hate and murder.
Even Nazism.
Yeah.
On the one hand.
Yeah, and all these Jews who are in prominent roles inside Ukraine and inside the government. It's bizarre. It makes no sense. But when you look at what they're interested in, the people who are running the country were interested in anything that would mobilize Ukrainians against Russians. And just as we in the United States are easily taken in by these unsophisticated depictions of the Soviet enemy 30 or 40 years ago and transposing that old picture of the enemy onto Russia, we're easily beguiled by that in the United States because we've been listening to bad people speak with Russian accents on television for decades. You had something similar happen in Ukraine.
But let's get back to the army itself. My question is, how come that the intelligence on both sides was failing?
I think there are two things that have to be taken into account because I've seen it happen here. It may be that President Putin received different kinds of intelligence assessments, and he picked and chose what he thought was appropriate.
You
have to take that into consideration.
Kind of wishful thinking.
I think I think President Putin is probably the single most adult and clear-thinking man in Europe and the world today.
And very prudent in a way.
And very prudent. But on this occasion, I think he grossly misjudged the West, and I think he misjudged what was going on. It was even worse than he thought. Because remember, in his mind, he was expecting any day that these Pershing II missiles from the 1980s that were banned under the INF, that we now call them Standard missiles, but they're very, very powerful and very quick, that those would show up in eastern Ukraine. And that would place them within minutes of striking the Russian nuclear deterrent and destroy their early warning system and so forth. That's what he was worried about. But he didn't. When he gets in there, he finds out this Ukrainian army is actually exceptionally good. It's not perfect, but it's damn good. And they have to make a decision after about several months, what are we going to do? And remember, they tried in Istanbul, and they thought they had an agreement because the keystone in the agreement was neutrality for Ukraine. And at that point, he was ready to back out of Ukraine. And that brings up something else that's interesting. When the Russian forces first entered eastern Ukraine, they encountered lots of Russians. Obviously, the people there were Russian. And they said, well, thank God you've come. And then the people said, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're just here to, push the Ukrainians back and then get a deal, and then we'll leave. And the Russian people there said, if you're going to leave, then the Ukrainian secret police will come back and put bullets in all of our heads. So many of them said, the hell with you. We're not going to support you. If you're not here to liberate us and protect us,
you're not here to stay.
Go home, you know. Literally, these conversations were held. This was reported back to Putin. This is where Putin begins to realize he's dealing with a different